Alright, for this tutorial we're going to be working on starting to create a drum kit out of our usual microphone recordings. You might have seen this in some of the free videos I released on YouTube. I'll be using pretty much the same techniques with a few change-ups here and there. When you're creating drum kits out of found sounds like this, I find that it often pays off to be open to what happens in the moment. It's good to have at least a little bit of a plan on what kind of a sound you want overall, but definitely be open to experimentation, because just by the very nature of recording in these found sounds, you're going to get a lot of variation in the results, and sometimes it's better if you just let it take you that direction rather than trying to force it to be something it's not. So with that said, we're going to be working on creating a kick drum, and then after that kind of a little bit of like a snare type sound, snare or a clap. With these sounds, it's always more of a hybrid than anything. And then after that, we'll work on creating some sort of a bass stab. So what we have here so far is just starting out with, again, with a recording I did with a microphone. And I should say a few words about how I achieved some of these sounds, because if you'll remember in my other tutorials, we're really talking about trying to achieve quality right off the bat in terms of your source material. And the more timbrally interesting your source material is, the more interesting the final result will be. So what we have here is a waveform of what I recorded in earlier. I have it looped and kind of warped in interesting ways just to manipulate the sound on the front end before it even goes through the sampler. So I'll play this loop. So the first thing you'll notice about that loop is that there's a lot of sort of perceived noise in the background, more so than usual, and that was actually an intentional step that I took by putting on a kettle full of hot water and just boiling that in the background while I recorded myself kind of hitting my the surface of my desk here, along with snapping my fingers a couple feet away from the microphone. The reason I did that was to add some grit to that sort of low-end rumble that you hear. And really what that's doing is just adding more interesting frequency information that can be manipulated later on. For practical purposes, what that means for us is that there's a lot of high-end hiss, and I'm going to filter some of that off. And what that will do is add some sort of animation to the release phase of that kick drum. That way the kick drum kind of sounds like it's almost a more natural kick drum that's being recorded inside of a recording studio or just a room somewhere, and it's picking up some of the reverberation off the walls. And you can do that very easily without even using a reverb unit. In fact, a lot of the time I like to create reverb-like effects using other methods. I find that the results are a little more unique than what you usually hear. So the first thing to do is take note of what sounds we have recorded here. And already those rumbling sounds sound like they'll be pretty good, especially for like a dirtier, almost like a dubstep kick or a grind kick. The way I achieved this rumbling sound is simply to place the microphone stand on a piece of plywood that's wrapped in some bath towels, and then place a few heavy objects on top of the piece of plywood right next to the microphone. So then when I lightly tap on the recording surface here, all of those interesting vibrations being caused by these objects sitting on top of my work surface here will be picked up by the microphone and recorded as low frequency information. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is set up a drum rack instrument. I really like the drum rack because it's easy to go through a sample such as this one, find the different hits that you enjoy, and then just drag them right onto the cells of the drum rack here. So let me show you a little bit about how to do that. It's pretty simple. You just go through a waveform and find the part that you like. I like this particular hit right here. It sounds like the best kick drum that I have recorded here, so I'm just going to isolate that sample. Alright, that's got enough release on it too, so we can play around with that. So I'm going to drag that kick drum down here to C2. Once I click on it, you'll see this blue hand come up, and that's because I have my MPD-24 drum pad here hooked up to Ableton Live as a control surface. So when I hit the pad here, it triggers that little kick drum sound. I'm going to go ahead and bring that volume up a lot. First thing I'm going to want to do is zoom in on the sample here. I want to make sure that I have enough release here. Alright, that's sounding pretty good. Now it does sound a little noisy on the top end, obviously, and that was an intentional move, so that now I can choose what frequencies I want to filter out on the high end and leave kind of a nice gritty sort of high-end buzz on top of the kick drum. That's one common mistake a lot of producers make, especially when they're starting out, is when they want to create their own kick drum, they mistakenly think that a kick drum is made out of only low-frequency information, which is not true, because if you want someone to be able to hear the kick drum rather than just feel it, you need to have a higher end sort of click sound on top of it, which represents the tapping of the membrane of a kick drum in real life. So that's partly the reason why I left that high end grit on top of that kick drum. It makes it sound dirty for one thing, which I really like. I don't like clean samples. And another thing is leaving high frequency information on top of that low frequency information, so you both feel and hear the kick. So what I'm going to do now is process this kick drum just a little bit more. It doesn't need too much. And that's another thing to keep in mind, is that you don't always need to process the heck out of your samples. Sometimes it's better just to leave them as is. So now I'm going to drop an auto filter onto this kick drum. So I'm just going to drag auto filter from up here, drop it onto the kick drum cell, and you'll see that it pops up here. And now I'm going to audition the kick drum sound while manipulating the cutoff frequency and resonance right here. Alright, that sounds pretty good. Notice that I changed the start point here so that we're actually getting a clicking sound at the beginning. Usually clicking sounds in your samples are a bad thing, but here it sounds really good, because it sounds a lot more like a kick drum now. You have that clicking sound up against the membrane of the drum, and then you also have the deep low frequency information. I'm going to adjust the release a little bit more here. Alright, now I'm going to go back and grab a snap or a clap sound, however you want to look at this. Alright, that looks good. I'm going to drop that onto the next cell here. And of course, again, you'll notice that the volume of the sample is reduced a lot here. So you can bring that back up. Now I'm going to bring the start point over here. There we go. Now I got a nice solid click sound. And again, I'm not going to do too much processing on this snapping sound. It sounds pretty good already. But I'm going to drop a filter on it and try to create some interesting filtering up in the high end, kind of give it some more character. One good tool for this is this band reject filter right here. which does exactly what it sounds like. It just rejects a certain frequency band. I'm going to widen the band using the resonance control. Alright, that's sounding pretty good right there. The next thing I want to do is give this little snap sound more presence. I could use EQ to do that, but what I'm really thinking about is presence over time. So I'm thinking more of a fade out. Using a reverb would be appropriate here. So what I'm going to do is turn on this button right here, which brings up all your chains and stuff, and then I'm going to turn on the sends and returns right down here. And then this second box down here underneath this list of the actual sounds that are in your drum rack represents the effects section. So if I drop a reverb right here, it creates a reverb send for me. And then up here you can see that I can send my individual sounds that I have in the drum rack in varying amounts to the reverb, just like up here with these sends. So I'm going to manipulate my reverb a little bit here. I'm going to send this click sound to the reverb, and I'm going to change some of these settings. So the decay time sounds correct, but some of the diffuse dispersion of the sound is a little bit too loud. So I'm going to turn that down. Alright, that sounds good. And then the last thing we're going to do is kind of create a little bass stab. So I'm going to go back to the source material here. That's just as good as anything else to create a bass stab. It's got plenty of low frequency information. And as you know from the other videos, all we have to do is loop some interesting timbres from this waveform right here and get a bass sound going. So I'm going to drag that into this third cell right here. And I'm going to turn this simpler into a sampler because I prefer to use the full-on sampler instrument when I'm doing melodic instruments. So I'm going to right click on the title right here, the title bar, and click on simpler to sampler. And there we go, it converts it to a sampler. Next I'm going to do what you've seen me do before, and that's zoom in on this waveform, manipulate some of these loop points. I'm going to turn on looping. Again, that back and forth mode is my favorite. I'm going to bring up the volume. I'm going to play around with the tuning now, because that frequency is too low for a bass line right now. Now the first thing I want to do with this bass line is to change up some of the filtering. So I'm going to turn on the filter here. And I know that I'm going to want to retain a little bit of the low and the high end, but I want to make an emphasis on the mid-range. It's going to be kind of a mid-range heavy bass line. So I'm going to turn up my filter morph here, and that way I get an emphasis right here in the middle. I'm going to kick the volume up just a little bit more. Also, I'm going to bring up the release phase. Next, I'm going to assign an envelope to the filter, and of course the filter has its own envelope right here. Also, I'm going to add a little bit of this oscillator to give it some more character. I like the way the oscillator affects that. I think it should come in a little bit with the envelope though. Also, I think there should be some manipulation of the volume of the oscillator effect here. That'll give the sound a more interesting flavor. And for that, I'm going to use the aux envelope here. I'm going to assign it to volume oscillator. Set it to affect the oscillator a lot. And then turn down the bass setting over here. There we go, now it's a little more animated. Next, I'm going to want to modulate the filter frequency again. Note that we already have modulation of the filter frequency with the filter envelope over here. So, if I set up an LFO over here to clash with the way the envelope is modulating the frequency, it'll create more interesting results than just a standard envelope. I can turn retrig off. And there we go. We at least have some interesting drum sounds going now, so we can start setting up a groove if we want to.